From the New Arts and Media Studios in Milwaukee, I'm Charles Purcell. This is The Log. Continuing, I guess, this anniversary for COVID is weird, isn't it? We talked about it last week. Everybody in the media has been talking about it all week. I guess it was really, there's not one date, like we said, there's not one date you can pinpoint. I think it was the 11th of March that it was declared a pandemic. Maybe that's a date, but it's more of a personal date. Like when's the last time you went to your job? When did you start working from home? Or when did you lose your job? Or, whatever. That's what it is for me, the last time I worked outside the house. And as many different ways as there are to mark it, there are at least that many ways to sort of define it. I mean, you can go the personal route. What kind of personal lessons have we learned? Of course, there's the national tragedy aspect of it, of course, more than every war combined except for the Civil War, and we're creeping up on that number. And, like any year, you look back at any year, there's going to be milestones. There will be odd kind of pop culture moments. In this case, the rise of Zoom and toilet paper and I don't know, what else would you point to? People putting bookshelves as their backdrop. I spent a good amount of time talking about the late night talk show hosts because that's a special interest of mine. I'm kind of a comedy nerd. And at the risk of falling down that rabbit hole again, that was something very interesting for me, watching live comedy, or at least live to tape broadcast comedy, have to change and really into just invent something wholly, completely new. And the transition of the different artists, I don't know, that's a little too pretentious of a word, I guess. But the late night guys, especially Colbert, I watch Colbert and Seth Meyers. I don't really watch the others. But the way they sort of had to figure it out, and how Colbert was just so lost. Stephen Colbert, oh my God, just couldn't figure out how to do it. It took him a while. He missed his audience so badly because if he was right here, right now, I don't think I'd offend him by calling him a laugh whore. That's what he is. I think he admits it completely. He absolutely feeds off that energy from the audience. He needs it. He has to have it. It's what makes him not only a performer, it seems to be what makes him a person. And I'm not speculating here. He said these very things himself. So it took him quite a while, but to his credit, he figured it out. He really did. I think his show now, and I'm speaking now personally just for myself, oh boy, the greatest lesson we learned in COVID was getting rid of live studio audiences. They're so obnoxious and so unnecessary. If you have a good broadcaster, if you have a good performer, look right in the camera and perform to me, your audience on the couch. That's where it is. And these guys, and Colbert especially, would rely so heavily on the audience, on the live audience, for their own energy, that it detracted from the performance he was giving through the camera. So he preferred the couple hundred people in his audience to the couple of million people watching at home. It just never made any sense to me. So he figured it out. And my other favorite guy, I really like Seth Meyers. I like his, what does he call it? The Closer Look segment he does most every night. He did too. He completely transitioned what he did when there was no live audience. His pace changed, his rhythms changed, everything changed. He transitioned beautifully. And boy, I would just love it if live audiences never came back. So, okay, let me stop there before I keep going and going. But, okay, so there's like a pop culture thing that might have happened in any year, but COVID definitely made it happen. What else? Well, of course, there's the whole political angle, which in most of the sort of look back at the year segments I've seen, people aren't spending a lot of time on that, and for good reason. I mean, I don't want to talk about the Orange Menace, but whenever you talk about COVID now or next year or 10 years or 100 years from now, You got to talk about the Orange Menace and how he completely blew it on every single front, how he's responsible for at least half the deaths. At least that's being charitable about it. So that it's hard to look back at that. Again, this is a weird anniversary. We can't put a single date on it. We also can't put a single feeling on it. It's so multi-layered. And part of it is just, should be at least, absolute rage at this monumentally incompetent and cold, uncaring, horrible excuse for a human being in the depths of this tragedy continued to make it about himself every time he got in front of a camera. Every single decision he made was the wrong decision. He's constantly lying, constantly misleading, and to the detriment of, at the cost of lives. At the time I'm speaking now, it's up to what, 530,000? You gotta figure at least half of those deaths, at least, are directly attributable to his action and or inaction. So that's part of the commemoration as well. It's going to be very interesting over the years to come and decades to come how history sees this event. And of course, also, at least for this anniversary, this first anniversary, we're still in the middle of the event, which in itself is difficult to handle. And again, these many layers of different feelings. We have the sorrow and the grief of those we've lost. We have the gratitude and love. I mean, the deepest gratitude for healthcare workers and their sacrifice, and they're absolute heroes, and there's no way you can overstate that. We got the rage and the anger at the Orange Menace administration. And it's not over. It ain't over by a long shot. As I speak to you today, we just heard from Joe Biden last week, commemorating the one-year anniversary, talking about the great success with the vaccine, and that's good news, and a little bit of a timetable. He couched it in some caution, which I think is the right thing to do. Tried to be optimistic by saying by the 4th of July, small family gatherings, okay. Still, it won't be the time for big, large gatherings, concerts, that kind of thing. And he warned us, even through all of his optimism, he warned us, again, as he should, that if we drop the ball, we're screwed and we're right back where we started, and we have a surge again, which is one of my biggest fears, because just look at, watch the news tonight, and you'll see the pictures of spring break in Florida and all the gatherings in Texas. And they're having another big bike rally this last weekend. I forget where that was. Kind of like the Sturgis rally in South Dakota. I think it's in Florida. I forget where it is. And that coupled with the new variants out of different parts of the globe. Just heard yesterday on the news that Florida has the most cases of one particular dangerous variant. They lead the nation in this particular variant. And so we'll see. We'll see what happens here in the next weeks and months. And then there's this angle as well, which I feel compelled to share with you. I've been relatively pleased with Joe Biden. He's not my guy, but I'm going to give him credit for what, especially around COVID. But World Socialist website, here's their headline for after his speech last week. Biden peddles national self-delusion on pandemic anniversary. Reading here from the article, they characterize the first 10 minutes of his speech as crammed with maudlin banalities, which I guess that's one way you could look at it. He's got this whole empathy thing, which, boy, I don't want to be cynical, but is it already getting to be too much? It's like, okay, we got it, Joe. We know. You're the empathizer. Yep, you're the king of that. I myself have praised him for that quality. But how many times is he going to go to that well? I mean, we missed it so badly the last 4 years. It's a big part of a president's job to have that ability to empathize with the nation in times of hardship. But it's Joe's calling card, and I don't know. It's almost becoming cliche so quickly because he's relying so heavily on it. And I know this sounds cynical, but, let's be honest. I should say this opinion is from a writer named Patrick Martin. Give him credit. He points out the billionaires and their increased wealth of $1.4 trillion and counting over the past year, while the economy collapsed and millions lost their jobs and small businesses closed forever, some of them. Stock market reached all-time highs. These are things that Joe didn't really highlight too much in his speech, that billionaires got richer by trillions and that investors in the stock market cashed in. Yeah, there are a lot of different ways you can frame this thing, and I think this is one voice that hasn't been heard enough, because Biden, reading again, in pursuit of his goal of national unity, said nothing at all about the class divisions that the pandemic has brought to the fore so clearly. He said little about the tidal wave of economic suffering unleashed by the pandemic, and made only one reference to the congressional passage of his American Recovery Act. Of course, that doesn't carry as much weight. He is, as we speak, literally on tour, crowing about it. So let's say that criticism is probably not called for here. But here's where I think Patrick Martin is onto something. Quote, "The most striking feature of the Biden speech was its narrow nationalism. He spoke as though coronavirus was a meteor that had crashed out of the sky and struck only the United States, not a global pandemic that has affected every country in the world. He did not acknowledge the 800,000 dead in Europe, or the nearly equal number of dead in Latin America, or the mounting death toll in India and throughout Asia, although not in China, where the pandemic began." Yeah, Biden really didn't touch on that, did he? And he won't in his tour, in his national tour here, that being how the United States, by far the worst of all major developed countries, by far the worst, it's not even close. This opinion piece points out that Joe Biden isn't going to get anywhere near the big corporate and financial interests that sort of drive the decision-making. Even now, when the vaccine is on everybody's mind, and I'm speaking for myself now, just the very notion, just getting right down to basics here, the very notion that these are private companies that need to be negotiated with and have to be paid, and it's just expected that they'll make a profit. I mean, sure, you're getting the shot for free, but they're not being given out for free. There is big money to be made by the major pharmaceuticals and their investors. So profit is being generated by this once in a lifetime, once in a generation, once in several generations disaster. And how is that moral under any code? How is that okay? Everything should have been shared. All the research into the vaccine, the development of the vaccine, tons of public money went into it, taxpayer money, millions and billions of dollars being paid to private pharmaceuticals, and then yet still they're allowed to profit off of this for years and years to come, because of course there's going to be a yearly booster. They're going to have sort of year-round testing and tweaking, and just like the flu vaccine, it gets tweaked a little bit every year. So it's just created this cash cow for the private pharma industry. If there was any such thing as justice in the world, there would be zero profit for anybody. Nobody gets to get rich off of this. That's just antithetical to any moral system I can imagine. So that pisses me off. So right now, even though we're trying to be optimistic and forward-looking, this perspective can't be ignored. There is some yelling to do today, and I'm kind of bouncing off this World Socialist website article to help me do it. Reading again. While Biden touted progress in manufacturing and distributing the vaccine, a quarter of the population encouraged by Republican demagogues and anti-vaxxers say they will not get the shots. The president made a veiled reference to this, suggesting that if the population failed to stick together and conditions change, we might have to reinstate restrictions. Yeah, he's never showed a whole lot of willingness to do that. But that's a concern of mine, that so many among us just aren't going to get it, just refuse to get it. Hopefully that number will be smaller rather than larger. So anyway, I felt that needed to be shared. I'm not necessarily all in with that. I think there's plenty of nuance. I think there's plenty of room for praise and caution. But I thought that voice is one that should be shared, and it's, for the most part, not being heard. You got to go to your favorite neighborhood lefty to find this kind of stuff. But, the vaccine thing, as happy as I am that they're having great success, and they are having pretty good success getting this thing out into people's arms. I'm going to have it here pretty soon, within the next month or so. But I can't help but think, not only the people here in the U.S. who refuse to take it, but the hundreds of nations, literally hundreds of nations, that haven't even had a single vaccine in a single arm. Our pal Bernie Sanders talked about this. We need a people's vaccine, not a profit vaccine, is the way he put it. And of course I agree, as we just talked about. And there are two reasons for this, at least two reasons. The top two reasons are, it's just basic moral thing to do. Why rich people deserve health and poor people don't makes no sense. You can't justify that. There's no way you can justify it. And the second reason is very practical, and that is, as long as it's out there, as long as the virus is allowed to proliferate on any part of the globe, none of us are safe. So there's the basic moral reason. I don't know how you argue against it. And then there's this very practical, pragmatic, scientific reason. If COVID is allowed to flourish anywhere on the planet, it puts us all in danger. And then it's a race between the variants, the various variants, and the various vaccines. Bernie Sanders said last week, quote, "Our government has invested enormous sums of taxpayer dollars into the production of these technologies. All people should benefit, not just a few already obscenely wealthy CEOs and shareholders in the wealthiest country on earth." No kidding. There's a lobbying effort going on right now regarding patent waivers, so-called, allowing private corporations to patent and privatize these vaccines will hinder distribution. Extending a patent waiver will do the opposite. It'll serve to get people vaccinated. Bernie Sanders last week sent a letter to the president demanding his support for the patent waiver plan so that we can rapidly expand supplies of vaccines without the constraints imposed by pharma monopolies. Let's finish with Bernie's quote. "Ending this pandemic requires collaboration, solidarity, and empathy. It requires a very different mindset, a mindset that puts people over profits at every turn. The pharmaceutical companies must not block this effort, and I join you in your request to temporarily waive WTO intellectual property protections on COVID-19 medical technologies during the pandemic." Yeah, an issue that's not in the nightly news so much, and nowhere to be found, either in last week's Joe Biden address or in the ensuing pep rally tour of Dr. Jill and Joe Biden and VP Harris and the second gentleman, all out touring the country as we speak. See, we can be optimistic and we can be happy about successes without having to be blind cheerleaders. It's not required. I think too many of us get the idea that once you've sort of chosen a side, you have to be 100% unwaveringly enthusiastic. You got to put on the blinders. You got to talk the talk. We're smart enough. We can be nuanced. We can be honest about the challenges. And once more, to Joe's credit, I think he's trying mostly to do this. But when it comes down to the really tricky, sticky, heavy stuff that only a socialist website dares to mention, yeah, Joe's not going to go there. He's not going to talk about patent waivers and the profits of the pharmaceuticals and how people in poor countries are getting screwed and ignored. No, he's not going to go that far because he's Joe. He's Joe. And, with this 1-year commemoration and with all the sort of light at the end of the tunnel conversations we're having, I find myself really sort of distraught at all the talk about getting back to normal. I kind of wish we could all check ourselves and never use that word normal again. As I look back at the early conversations surrounding COVID about this time last year, and especially as we went through March and April, we started talking about all the big lessons we're learning, about learning the difference between essential work and non-essential work over time, and it didn't take long to understand who was getting hit the hardest. And of course, it's always people without means get hit the hardest. Migrant workers certainly stayed in the fields and in meat production plants. At one point, the Orange Menace even declared the workers in these big, huge meat processing factories, declared them to be essential workers. Workers in the big Amazon distribution centers. All of these low-wage, hard-working people deemed essential. You must keep working. Denied unemployment benefits for anybody who cited their own health as a reason to leave their job. Nope, you can't do it, not allowed. While so many in the middle and upper class could just switch to their home office and get on Zoom for their meetings, and they hardly dropped a beat. So all these lessons we learned, all those many lessons we've learned. But have we? That's the point. We haven't. After a year of this, we're still talking about getting back to normal. Normal sucked. Normal was unequal. The people who did the real work, who made this country run, who made this world go around, they were exploited back when things were normal. And their exploitation was only heightened during the pandemic because they were literally forced to continue working. And so what do you think? So who's going to do the most dying here in this pandemic? So it was bad before, then the pandemic comes along, the injustice, the unfairness of the whole thing is revealed, and somehow we rationalize our way through it, and now all we can talk about is getting back to normal? I don't want to get anywhere near normal. I want these lessons to be actually learned. Here, an example of this. Hospitals, for-profit hospitals, one of the reasons they were so ill-prepared was because of the whole kind of Walmart philosophy. There's never any bloated inventory. You have the bare minimum of inventory you need. You have the bare minimum of labor that you need just to meet the projected need for services. To have any extra beds, to have any extra PPE, to have any extra personnel, well, that just cuts into your profit, so they don't exist. And then when an emergency comes up, you have to ramp up very quickly, and so that's why it took forever, in some cases to this very day, to have adequate facilities, PPE, beds, ventilators, etc. Now you got this big old emergency, you have to ramp everything up. Well, to this very day, hospitals haven't changed their MO one little bit. They're still putting profits over everything else. So if and when we have a surge, and God, I hope we don't, but it's certainly possible, especially with the way we're behaving right now, if we have a surge, they're going to be caught with their pants down again. And if there was no excuse a year ago, there's certainly no excuse now. Reading now from People's World. 1 year after the coronavirus pandemic officially hit the U.S., hospital bosses still put profits over patients and staff safety, forcing nurses to cut corners, a new National Nurses United survey shows. In its top finding, 81% of the 9,200 registered nurses surveyed in February reported they must reuse what are supposed to be single-use protective gear. That's virtually unchanged since the union's prior survey in November. Hospital administrators are continuing to jeopardize one of society's most valuable workforces during COVID-19, registered nurses, by prioritizing profits over basic safety and infection control measures. That's NNU Executive Director Bonnie Castillo. Almost half of all hospitals still aren't testing incoming patients for the virus, according to the registered nurses who took this survey. Only 2/3 of hospitals have separate COVID-19 units. When a worker does test positive, only 1/3 of institutions warn the worker's colleagues. Hospitals are also continuing short staffing. National Nurses United convinced lawmakers to enact mandatory nurse-to-patient ratios, especially in key areas such as intensive care units. Hospitals, egged on by insurers interested in profits, opposed such requirements. So this is happening right now, as we speak. Again, lessons not learned. For-profit hospitals, when we shouldn't have a for-profit healthcare system at all. So at this point, if we were actually learning these lessons instead of just having them go in one ear and out the other, we'd be doing something about higher pay for essential workers, better pay, better conditions, and decent immigration reform for the millions of migrant workers in those fields and in those factories. We'd certainly have Medicare for all, and that's everybody. If you are within the borders of this country, you get free health care, regardless of your immigration status, regardless of your wealth or lack of it. We would have universal broadband accessibility, because we've seen now that it is just nothing less than an essential utility. You got to have your damn internet if you want to register to vote, if you want to sign up for the vaccine and get the vaccine, if you want to apply for a job, if you want to work from home. I mean, all communications, both business and personal, paying bills. Hell, you want to get on the bus, you need your app. You got to have that app to pay your bus fare. I mean, it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. It's universal. And then as we look back at this historic year, my God, it's not only COVID, it's Breonna Taylor, and it's George Floyd, and it's Black Lives Matter, and it's the election, and it's the big lie, and it's the attack on the Capitol. All of this while climate crisis continues. You know, do you remember in the very early stages, all the empty streets and the clear skies, and we all looked in amazement at how the earth was suddenly healing itself when everybody was locked in for a while. Emissions fell to next to nothing. We saw clear skies in China where once there was only smog. We saw wild animals frolicking through downtown city streets. There was this amazing phenomenon that was happening. But lesson learned? No lessons learned. By the time the year was out, we still were seeing record carbon emissions. We're still logging in as hottest year on record. Ice caps continue to melt at rates we hadn't even dreamed of a year ago. As hopeful as I try to be, we seem to be learning nothing, exactly nothing. We need a livable wage. No person should work and be poor. Nobody. We need a universal basic income. We need free education up through at least 4 years of college. We need Medicare for all. We need civil rights legislation with teeth. We need election reform legislation with teeth. If we come out of this year and all we have to show for it is, oh, okay, now we're all really used to being on Zoom meetings. We've all mastered that technology, and we've mastered sourdough bread. If we come out of this and that's all we got, shame on us. Shame on us. So this is my plea today. This is my plea. As we commemorate whatever the hell this is, the first year since the beginning of a pandemic that we're still in the middle of, that we don't really know what the future is. We're hopeful, but who knows? You know, meet me right here again in 1 year, and let's see how this thing played out. And let's see if we've learned anything. Things are bad. They could be worse. They might get worse if we don't stay on the ball. And I love you. I'm Charles Purcell.